the wages of non-union workers. And if you look at, say, men without a college degree, you're talking about wages in 2014 that are about $3,000 a year lower, non-union, lower because of the decline of unionization since the late 1970s. It's about as big as any other single cause that you can really identify. What has caused wages to stagnate? How much higher would wages have been? The decline of unionization is about as big a single cause as you can find. And in aggregate dollar terms, like total dollars in the economy, the decline of unions has actually taken more money out of the pockets of non-union workers than union workers. There's a lot more non-union workers who've been hurt over time. You may wonder, how do unions make higher pay for typical workers possible? Where does the money come from? I mean, it mostly comes from two places. I mean, one, there's a small positive productivity effect of unions on firms. This is well documented in the literature. When employers have to pay their workers more, there's just no, they actually have some leverage and I have to pay them more. They think to themselves, well, might as well make them as productive as possible. And so in a non-union workplace where wages are really, really low, do you make sure they have all the up-to-date equipment to make them as productive as possible? Do you make sure everyone is well managed to the absolute highest degree possible because any waste is really expensive? Not really. But all of a sudden when your workers become well paid, it really matters that they become as productive as possible. And so there's that productivity effect. The other way unions make higher pay for typical workers possible is they restrain the growth of otherwise exorbitant managerial pay. And this is pretty well documented too. If you look at companies and you look at their CEO pay is much more out of line in non-unionized companies. And that's not just the direct bargaining effect of unions. Unions are also pretty good at advertising when their CEOs make ridiculous pay amounts. And so if you think CEO pay, it's like, is it worth taking this much money given all the outrage that'll generate? If the outrage can go under the radar, that's pretty easy. If you have a group dedicated to making sure that that outrageous pay does not go under the radar, that provides a little bit of discipline on that. So, unions, in our view, we think the evidence is really clear here, they're really vital to providing leverage and bargaining power to low and middle wage workers. And so, well, if they're so valuable, why did they decline so rapidly? What's going on there? And one thing we know, it's not because people don't want them. In your handout, you will see a survey of non-union workers who are asked the question, would you vote for an election or an association of workers today if you knew that the election results would be honored? In 2007, it's the last time this survey results were made publicly available. It was over 50% of non-union workers who said they would vote for a union today, and it's up considerably since the 1980s. So it's not the case that somehow workers are deciding more and more to walk away from unions. Something else is going on. What's going on is all the things Dean talked about. I mean, basically, policy has failed to keep the playing field level between workers who want to join together in a union versus an employer class that has become increasingly hostile to these efforts to bargain collectively. And in the handout, I have a couple tables here from a paper that someone named Kate Bronfenbrenner did for us at EPI. Basically, the name of the paper is No Holds Barred. And it basically looks at the tactics employers use to defeat union organizing drives. These include things like there's now an entire management consulting business that is how to defeat unions. And they include things like, you have captive meetings with employees and you tell them you'll be fired or we'll close the plant. You mail them DVDs about all the bad things that have happened to people in the past who tried to unionize. The share of workplaces that fight a union drive with more than 5 of these tactics has gone from 38% to 82% over the past 30 years. The number of employers who use more than 10 of these tactics over that time period has gone from 0 to 50%. And so there's clearly increasing employer hostility. It works. From the narrow-minded perspective of keeping profits high, it works to invest in keeping your workplace from being unionized. And I think the private-public example is a really good one, because in that exact same paper, Bronfenbrenner looks at the public and private sector, and until recently, the public sector was much more hands-off when it came to organizing drives. They essentially mostly allowed them to happen. If you look at organizing campaigns in the public sector in the late 90s and early 2000s that had no opposition at all, and the public sector is over 50%, no opposition at all. Didn't do anything, just let the workers try to organize. In the private sector, that number was 6%. 6% of private sector employers did nothing. And what you see in the numbers is public sector unionization it's still higher, and it's still held up much better than the private sector. And I think that has led to what Dean talked about. it's worked really well in the private sector just to batter away at unions, and so why not start, importing that really effective private sector hostility to the public sector? We've done such a great job in the private sector crushing unions. Let's try to import that. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of what that past evidence tells us. It's not workers walking away from unions or finding them unnecessary anymore. It is all about, can we actually keep the playing field level between people trying to organize versus their employers who don't want them to organize, when the playing field is kind of level, which it mostly was in the public sector over lots of the past 30 years, you do not see that rapid decline in unionization. And then I think I'll wrap up just that there's one last slide. It looks like this one. We often get accused at EPI of just leaving people completely depressed. And so this one, slightly more hopeful. It's recent survey results from Pew. Apparently younger Americans view unions much more favorably than other segments of society. Even young Republicans, 18 to 34-year-old Republicans, are completely split, 50-50. Not 50-50, it's like 45-45, on favorable, unfavorable on unions. Compare that to older Republicans, where you just see the enormous split, huge unfavorable versus. Overall, 18 to 29-year-olds have a favorable view of unions by about 20 percentage points. It's sort of shocking to me because given the decline in unionization, I bet a lot of young people just have never really encountered, but I feel like what that is a thirst for something big and powerful, and just something to push back against that complete helplessness people feel in the American economy over the past 30 years. The idea that, how am I ever going to have any kind of leverage to carve out a decent, secure life? Heck, I'm going to try this union thing that I've heard about, and I feel like is part of what's going on there. So I'm going to end there. I'm just going to say, what would a agenda look like to actually resuscitate unions? It starts small. It starts with enforcement. If you illegally fire somebody trying to organize a union in your workplace, the penalties should be real. They should hurt. And so there's something called the Wages Act, which would triple the penalties that currently exist for the NLRB. Currently, employers have to pay your back pay if they fire you illegally, but they don't have to pay you for the time you got another job while you're waiting for the outcome of the case. That seems insane. And so that's another change that could happen. And then after that, ways to make workers who want to organize not have to go through the tortuously long NLRB election process, where basically an election, you gather half the workers who signed a card who say, I want an election. You turn them into the NLRB. During this time, the employer hears about this, starts firing people. The NLRB says, okay, you can have an election. That'll be a couple months away. That's a couple more months where the employer can fire people and send them DVDs about how the plant will close. There needs to be some way to not have that space of time where people are pretty defenseless against all of the things employers can do to fight this. And so people are thinking hard about this. There's something called the Employee Free Choice Act in 2009 that couldn't quite get the votes in the Senate that it needed. But really fundamental changes to keep the playing field level are what is needed, and it's important. So it's something that people should be keeping their eye on. And that's it. I'm happy to talk about whatever people would like to talk about. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear? Is this one working?
Yeah.
Okay. We're now going to, at the time we have left, open the discussion for Q&A. We hope to wrap up by 7:15, but the next meeting doesn't start until 7:30, so we may go a little bit longer since we were delayed starting. There are two roving mics. Michelle Menapace has one. Ricardo Coleman has the other one. For those of you who want to ask questions, please raise your hand, be recognized, state your name. Try to limit your question to 1 minute. Don't make a speech. Direct your question to a specific speaker or to both. And please don't interrupt others. So let's begin. And Ed will be managing and acknowledging, recognizing hands. Okay.
Ron? Hi, my name is Ron Krause. Worked a long time in the labor movement. And of course, as bad as you've been mentioning it, of course will get worse because there's a Supreme Court case that you're probably aware of. Likely will be decided next year, called the Janus case, which will make right to work for all public employees throughout 50 states. So we have not seen the worst of it. Right. So yes. So, and also there are public employee unions in the South, Texas, AFT and NEA has a combination of about 100,000 members. They just can't collectively bargain.
Okay.
Right? So, just that point. But here we are in the Fairfax County Democratic Committee, and you made the point that Democrats have not always been the friend of labor. If you go back to labor law reform in the 1970s, if you go back to Clinton administration and the Obama administration, I've been in rooms where Democratic politicians promised they would support labor's agenda, never ever came for a vote. So what are your recommendations to Fairfax County Democratic Committee, who have Democratic politicians that we generally support because they are good on 80% of the stuff, but they are not necessarily always good on labor issues? From your perspective, what are the arguments other than ours, that can convince Democratic politicians to support labor, that it's in not only their own interests, but in the interests of their constituencies?
Well, in terms of their own interest, again, I think the evidence is pretty clear. There's a lot of polling data that, union members, controlling for everything are much more likely to vote Democratic. In particular, a lot of talk about the white working class, which obviously went for Trump, huge margins. And, I haven't seen for the election, I don't know if you've seen union members in the election, white working class, but in any case, at least prior to that, what you found consistently was white working class union members voted by small margins for Democrats, even though their non-members voted overwhelmingly for Republicans. It shouldn't be hard. I mean, they might not want to hear that, but the fact that you will have much more electoral power with a larger union base. And again, what are the states that are widely blue? They all have large, at least compared to the rest of the country, large union membership. In terms of the country as a whole, I mean, Josh gave very good data on this. I mean, it's you really have to beat up the data not to find a story where unions lead to more equality, a better society in a lot of different ways. And, it is cross-country. I mean, one of the points, Josh is making the point that union, the polling data that people will say they want to join a union if given that option. We did a paper a few years back. If you compare Canada to the U.S., Canada's unionization rate is still close to 30%. We looked at, I forget our start point, mid-70s, late 70s. Our unionization rates, they always had somewhat more union members than we did. I mean, they were in their early mid-30s. We were around 20. There's no big decline in Canada over this period. It falls 2 or 3 or 4 percentage points. There's no big decline. And if you're trying to make this story that it's just like, oh, unions are antiquated, they don't fit people's needs anymore, a little hard pressed. I mean, Canada's not that different a country than the U.S., so if it's happening in a real big way here and it's not in Canada, that suggests it's not some sort of natural economic development. In Canada, I'll just mention 2 big obvious differences. One, that they do have something like we got the Employee Free Choice Act, where they do have card check recognition. The other, which might be as important or even more important, is also part of the Free Choice Act, they have mandatory arbitration for first contract, because often here, even when you do get a union recognized, the company plays games because the requirement that you bargain in good faith. I'm sure you know this. I mean, essentially, you show up at the table and smile. That you've met your requirement. And in Canada, if you can't, there's, I don't know exact rules, and it varies by province, but if there's an impasse, then it goes to an arbitrator, and they say, okay, here's the contract. So that seems to have been the big factors in why they still have pretty strong unionization rates in Canada.
One thing you asked me about Virginia, we had collective bargaining for public employees until 1978. David?
I appreciate.
You're good.
It was good.
Yep.
It was good, Dave.
It's good?
Yeah.
Yep.
I appreciate the analysis that you offered, which is perceptive and you're correct, and obviously very well documented. But except for what you mentioned, Josh, about some of the things that might happen to keep unions in power or re-empower them, it seems as though we don't have much of a blueprint that you're offering for how we could save unions, especially given the amount of anti-union work out there from the other side. In this regard, there's recently something I saw in the Post or somewhere that unions are great because they now have a 61% approval rate, which is up substantially from what it was 10 or 12 years ago, which sounds great, but approval doesn't seem to be getting us more union members or helping us unionize. Would you care to address either one of you or both of you the issue of how can we revive unions effectively, realistically?
I mean, I'll say a couple words on it. I mean, I'll start by saying I don't really know the sort of silver bullet. I think when unions, so on one of the charts I gave out, you see the real explosion of unionization in the United States that happens between like 1935 and 1950, and that was in part policy, the Wagner Act. It was in part workers themselves deciding this was absolutely vital, the sit-down strikes, the Wagner Act. And so my guess is that there will have to be some actual social movement. It's not just going to be legislation. But at the moment, we can at least make the legislation stop hitting labor over the head. And so, I mean, the obvious first one is there will be right to work, I am sure, in the upcoming state legislative battles in the coming year. They spring up everywhere now. Defeating right to work initiatives in states is the key first thing. There's still something being introduced in Congress called the Wages Act, which stiff penalties on people who illegally fire people trying to organize unions. After that, I do think it's a big intellectual project for organized labor to figure out what is the big legislative lever that we can ask of our allies. I don't think that's obviously out there, at least I don't know. But.
Well, before we all get too depressed, I work in the airline industry under the Railway Labor Act, which covers two industries, rail and air, because they're interstate commerce. 75% of the employees are unionized. The only big group that's not are Delta flight attendants. Delta pilots are even unionized. Now, part of that is historically the railroads went through incredible upheaval during the 20th century, and they sat down and they created the Railway Labor Act with management. And also the nature of the industry, because it's 24/7 operation, the opportunities for abuse of employees is incredible. People learn very quick, I have to get control of my life, I need a contract, otherwise they will. I get off a flight, they say, oh, excuse me, could you please get on that plane, we need you for another weekend. I mean, they literally used to do that. They don't do it anymore. And although the industry in the early 2000s after 9/11, when everybody lost their defined benefit plan through bankruptcy, the contracts now are actually very good, and I can say at United Airlines, after 5 years of negotiations, we got an agreement with the average employee, got a $15,000 increase per year in the first year. And so there really is a bright spot, and it's just a matter of organizing and staying together and fighting. And I'm not going to get into the strike strategy we have, but it's been very effective, and just the strategy we have about striking with intermittent strikes has actually prevented any interruptions for our union members for like 20 years.
Hi, I'm Jim McCarthy. I'm currently reading Democracy and Change. I'm extraordinarily impressed that
It's hard to hear you.
I'm sorry. I'm currently reading Democracy and Change. It's a book by, I think the name is Nancy McLean. It traces the history of anti-unionism back 40, 50 years, starting with a guy by the name of James Buchanan, who won a Nobel Prize for economics. But what I'm most struck by, his work got morphed into that of the Koch brothers. And in Fairfax County, that work still lives with us at George Mason University in a thing called the Institute for Humane Studies. What these folks have been able to do is marry some economic thoughts with some political ideas that make things like right to work a monument. And of course, right here in Fairfax County, we have the National Right to Work Foundation. So we have lots of symbols here individually. But what I think I heard the two gentlemen saying, and I have the same question, what is the common language, arguments, both political and economic, that individuals can make in a conversation with a Republican over, for example, how do we convince them that right to work is not right to work? How do we get these ideas across? And it's great you guys are studying these issues, but what's not translated is what do we say? What are the messages we